So this is our program for the week of January 1st, 2025. Yesterday, Israeli strikes killed at least 77 Palestinians, including an attack on a designated safe zone in Al-Mawasi camp in Khan Yunis. This was the deadliest day of attacks in the region since this past October. Incredibly, the official death count continues to ascend, even as we are reaching well over a year since the genocide began. Um, and even as there is a vast undercount of fatalities, given the thousands who are missing and unaccounted for, and the incessant attacks on Palestinian journalists attempting to document and report the aftermath of Israel's consistent bombing attacks. Even within the last several hours, there are more reports of bombings killing as many as 52 Palestinians today, as Israel continues its attack on hospitals and civilian infrastructure across Gaza. Samer, there are innumerable threads to follow here, from the attacks today and yesterday to the detainment of the director of the Kaman Al-Wan hospital, Hussam Abu Safia, to the latest round of ceasefire talks with Hamas happening in Doha, to the ramifications of Trump's inauguration in just a couple of weeks, and the now unlikely prospects of that hostage deal that he so vociferously demanded before he takes office. It's great to be back together with you and Annie in the new year. And with so much to cover at the moment, let us know what you plan to cover with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. It's great to be back as always after a surprisingly long break. There is, 3 weeks worth of things that I obviously could not jam pack into a single session, and so I tried to focus a little bit more, as I always do, on the things that happened in this past week, but added in what I thought was, really critical developments from the weeks prior, and maybe just taking a moment as we, tick over into the third calendar year of this genocide to do some like broader reflection and things. So I picked out a few of the sort of long form reporting and research that came out at the end of last year that I think hopefully people will find useful. So that's the kind of broad overview of things.
Well, great. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. Um, so jumping right in with the same slide that Thomas just showed us, the official death count has gone up quite a bit over the time that we've been gone. Um, It's shockingly high, and this past week in particular has been really brutal in Gaza. Thomas mentioned the bombings that killed 77 people just yesterday. I do believe that that's included in this count, but I don't think it has included the 52 that were killed today by another series of airstrikes. So those numbers are quite horrific, and I think sort of tied to these upcoming ceasefire negotiations, and we'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. I wanted to put on this Lebanon infographic one last time because it appears that Al Jazeera has stopped updating it in December. So even though the death count is now well over 4,000 because Israeli attacks, in fact, have not stopped, um, we'll probably find a different way of relaying that information to you since Al Jazeera doesn't seem to be updating it. One high level thing on the death count that I thought was worth folks' attention is just the official population bureau statistics coming out of Gaza, which has shown a 6% total drop in the population. And, it's important to recognize that this is based on the combination of the official death count, which, as we just saw, is just over 45,000, and the number of people who have been confirmed to have left, which is about another 150,000 or so, just shy of that, actually. And so the real population drop is significantly, significantly higher than this, probably at least double. And so we're talking about over 10% of the population of Gaza gone over the course of a year. And so, if that's not genocide, I don't really know what is. I also added this CIA World Factbook thing here, not because I think you should look at it. In fact, please don't. But just because there has been some weird misinformation going around where people are using this CIA fact book. They updated their Gaza population figures just a few weeks ago, and it does not show a population decrease. And people are using that to say, like, oh, look, it's all propaganda, like people in Gaza are fine. But even by their own accounting, the CIA is using numbers from 2023. And so if you see that anywhere, just to note that those population numbers, in fact, are not even remotely accurate for the situation on the ground now. they represent the way things were before this latest round of genocide, despite the fact that the page was just updated, is updated with data from a year ago. Um, Moving into the things that have been happening in the Gaza Strip, there has been a lot in these past 3 weeks, and even just frankly in these last few days. A series of really brutal bombings on New Year's Day that killed almost 30 people. And then yesterday, easily the bloodiest day in Gaza in months, where dozens of people, at least 77 that have been counted, were killed through a series of over 30 airstrikes conducted across the entire Gaza Strip. A lot of them in the north, and a lot of them in the designated safe zones of Al-Mawasi. So these specific places that Israel told people to go is specifically where they've been bombing them. And that includes the chief of police for Gaza, as well as his deputy and a lot of other people. And that's just the sort of aerial bombardments. There's a series of other catastrophes happening across Gaza with armed incursions from the IDF. And also, due to the lack of infrastructure, one of the things that we saw this week was um, because of the freezing temperatures, people are dying from the cold, including 6 babies who died from freezing over the course of this past week alone. So just unimaginable conditions that continue to just get horrifically worse. In the context of all of that, the sort of Israeli claim of cleaning out Hamas infrastructure and these ongoing ideas that they've somehow uh, caused all of this destruction because they have, dismantled the military capabilities of Hamas, continue to just prove to be totally false. Like that's clearly not what they're doing, and they're not capable of it, and they haven't succeeded in doing that. So, just 2 days ago, um, in Rafah, which for folks who have been attending these PSAs for a while now, no, the IDF had claimed that they had full operational control over Rafah and had completely dismantled Hamas's capabilities there about 2 or 3 months ago. Have just found another long-range rocket factory operating in Rafah. So, like, no, right? The Israeli ability to sort of contain Hamas military capabilities in the Gaza Strip is totally failing. And so it seems very clear to me, at least, that that is not, in fact, the thing that the primary thing that they're trying to do here. It really is just that level of civilian suffering and harm. Um, in the meantime, the strikes against Hamas officials continues pretty unabated, but they aren't really going after Hamas military commanders at this point so much as they're going after the sort of internal governance apparatus of Gaza. So this same strike, the one at Al-Mawasi that killed the chief of police, also killed one of the senior members of the internal security apparatus. And I wanted to highlight this one in particular because of the sort of detached irony of this Newsweek article that does not even thoughtfully piece together the two things that it's saying here, where the first paragraph talks about, oh yeah, they killed the head of the internal security apparatus. Um, and then like a few paragraphs later, the region is struggling with a breakdown in law and order and delays in essential aid, which like, yeah, Israel is assassinating everybody who's in charge of internal security. So again, that seems to be quite purposive here. And in the context of all of that, the big story in Gaza this week, of course, has been the just complete and utter destruction of the Kamal Adwan Hospital, the last functioning hospital in northern Gaza, clearly part of this so-called general's plan of, eliminating the ability for Palestinians to continue to live in northern Gaza. So taking out the last functioning hospital was a key part of that plan, and they have now completely done it. And a sort of key piece of this, at least as far as the media narrative is concerned, is around the director of the hospital, Hussam Abu Safie, who has remained at Kamal Adwan Hospital despite this weeks long offensive. We were talking about this back in December, uh, if folks were here and remember that. And Hussam Abu Safia has stayed the entire time, recording things that were happening and relaying information about what the IDF was doing to the hospital. And that includes, the drones that were dropping bombs on the facilities, these like robots that were dropping off explosive devices in front of the thing, airstrikes, sniping, assassinations, Israeli forces going into the hospital, setting parts of it on fire, beating and killing medical workers. And now, with the full destruction of the hospital, he himself has been taken in by the Israeli security forces. Um, uh, and there's that sort of iconic photo um, that you can see on the Intercept article to the left here of him in his white lab coat walking towards the Israeli armored personnel carriers amid the hospital's rubble. Uh, His whereabouts are somewhat unknown, although it does seem, based on some eyewitness accounts, that he's being held in Sde Timan, that Israeli torture detention facility that we've talked about multiple times on the PSAs, where Palestinians have been raped to death on multiple occasions in this sort of, like there was that giant riot in Israel because they tried to prosecute a few of the soldiers who were committing those rapes, and then they ended up walking back those prosecutions. That's where he's currently being held, it seems. Nobody knows for sure. So there is a giant, very coordinated campaign right now to get him out. And I think it's a really powerful and a really important way of bringing attention to what's happening. That's gaining the attention of, medical workers all over the world, various governments. The UN Security Council is actually meeting uh, this week. I think they're actually meeting today to talk about Israeli assaults on health infrastructure in Gaza. And so I've included here this link tree that has various actions calling for the release of Hossein Abu Safie. I would really recommend folks go through that whole list and fill out all of them. Um, I think, a really important rallying call that sort of encapsulates the horror and the devastation that Israel is committing in Gaza right now. And so it's a good tool that I think we can use to pressure the Israeli government to do something, to sort of respond to the pressure around what's happening with these hospital attacks. And it's important for us to, I think, reflect on the fact that in the absence of that kind of pressure, what Israel is doing, of course, is continuing these attacks on health infrastructure. And so just today, they've started the same sort of besiegement on another hospital, Al Auda Hospital, and have ordered its total evacuation. So we need to make sure that their ability to do that is as constrained as we can make it. So that's all the stuff happening. Well, that's nowhere near all the stuff, but that's some of the stuff happening on the ground in Gaza. In terms of the ceasefire negotiations that have sort of started back up again in the last few weeks because Trump has pushed really hard for the ceasefire to be in place before he takes office. Those, in a way that will not be surprising to longtime listeners, appear to not be moving forward in any meaningful way. Israel is sending an intelligence and military delegation to Qatar for this new round of ceasefire negotiations. And it seems that Bassem Naim, the foreign minister, basically, of Hamas, has said that they're very eager for a ceasefire to be signed, uh, and stated very clearly the position and stipulations that they would have for that ceasefire, which is, again, a permanent end to the hostilities and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. And both of those things, according to the Israeli government, are non-starters. So it's hard to see how this is really going to move forward. A lot of the negotiations lately have been about not a permanent ceasefire, but a temporary cessation of hostilities. But even that has gotten really mired in sort of intransigent positions between the Israelis and Hamas, where, you know, Hamas is supposed to be releasing 30 some odd prisoners in exchange for the hostages that Israel has taken or the political prisoners held in Israeli jails. But some of the key people that Hamas wants released, including Marwan Barghouti, the Israelis are saying no. So even that sort of cessation of hostilities thing doesn't seem to be moving. And you can see this uh, article that I had flagged to add into the slideshow a few days ago when the title of that New York Times article, I kept it on the right there. Luckily, I still had that screen open, where it originally said Gaza ceasefire before Trump's inauguration looks unlikely. And the editors later changed that title to As Biden's term ends, Gaza truce efforts proceed cautiously. So like goes to show that I don't think there's a lot of faith that a ceasefire breakthrough is going to happen anytime soon. But they seem to be hedging language around that. So like it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's not looking very likely. What that means for how the ceasefires will proceed under a Trump administration is a really big open question. You know, he's made those sort of bombastic claims about there being hell to pay if there are still any Israelis held by Hamas by the time he takes office, which does look like it's going to happen. So I think we'll see very soon what that actually means. And we'll know more, I think, about the ceasefire negotiations next week. Uh, I wanted to come back around to something we talked about in the last PSA, which was that Amnesty report accusing Israel of genocide, which was a really, really powerful report. Again, if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend it. And at the time, we had talked about how the chair of the board of Amnesty Israel had resigned over the release of the report, and it wasn't clear whether why that person was resigning and whether he was doing so, you know, sort of in critique of Amnesty International or because he disagreed with the folks in Amnesty Israel. And it turns out that it is very much the latter. And so he wrote this opinion article in Forward that I would really recommend. It's actually quite a powerful article, basically saying that uh, he couldn't remain part of Amnesty Israel, which, you know, is a like the Israeli branch of Amnesty International that disagreed with the findings of the report. Amnesty Israel basically said, like, yes, war crimes are being committed in Gaza, but it's not genocide. And so the chair of the board said, like, that position claims to be an expert minority opinion, but is in fact, the words he used is little more than the expression of an Israeli Jewish worldview to the exclusion of Palestinian voices. Like basically saying like you just don't want to admit that it's genocide, even though it's very clearly documented as genocide. So really powerful op-ed that I would recommend. And in the intervening weeks since that Amnesty report came out, there have been a number of other big reports also accusing Israel of genocide in various ways. These are generally a little bit more specific and a little bit more focused on a particular aspect of the Israeli genocidal project. So, for example, this Human Rights Watch report specifically looks at the deprivation of water uh, and the extent to which the absence of water has been the sort of like key part of the genocidal plan of Israel. Um, and it shows here, you know, that the World Health Organization says that the minimum amount of water required to meet basic needs is 50 to 100 liters per day. And uh, in Gaza, people are getting 2 to 9 liters per day. And that's, you know, 50 to 100 is sort of like the sustained amount over time. In emergency situations, like the basic, you know, sphere level, like humanitarian consensus on the minimum needed to sustain life is 15 liters per day. And so people in Gaza are getting 2 to 9, and that's compared to getting 83 before October 7th. So a really powerful report that I think really outlines how that sort of specific cutting off of basic uh, the necessities of life really constitute this sort of it's hard to in very meticulous detail. Human Rights Watch goes into how it's very clear that Israel is doing this on purpose and they could very easily be getting water in, and in fact, they're doing the opposite. They're blocking it whenever they can. And similarly, Doctors Without Borders put out a report a couple of weeks ago, very grimly named Life in the Death Trap That Is Gaza. And this one, I think, goes into some of the ways in which the Israeli assault is meant to and is succeeding in completely destroying the entire social fabric of the Gaza Strip in ways that are going to be very difficult to uh, undo. And this, again, a very hard read, but a really meticulously well thought out report that also basically accuses Israel of genocide. And as with the Human Rights Watch report and the Amnesty report, you know, not only call for increased humanitarian aid, not only call for an immediate ceasefire, but in a way that's really unprecedented for human rights organizations like these, is very directly calling for arms embargo and sanctions against the Israeli government for what it's doing in Gaza. And so all of that is really powerful. These are very well respected organizations at the international level. And so um, those are things that I think, you know, mean something in a way that we'll come back to it a little bit. And I want to highlight that it's not just international organizations that are doing this. Al-Haq, which is an incredible Palestinian legal organization, which for all of its incredible work that it does in Palestine has been labeled a terrorist organization by the Israeli government, wrote an incredible report on how to hide a genocide that is specifically looking at the use of evacuation orders and safe zones and how those are used by Israel, uh, basically in this Orwellian way that what they call safe zones are basically extermination areas that are specifically designed uh, to allow them to, massacre people more easily. So again, a hard read, but a very meticulously researched and a very thoughtful report that, yeah, I do think is worth reading to understand how this safe zone stuff operates. You can see here, for those watching this, on the map on the right that shows the safe zone in blue in southern Gaza and the extent to which that safe zone has been bombed, which is, as you can see, very, very, very heavily. And speaking of these war crimes, an article came out just before Christmas that I was really stunned by in Haaretz, uh, that was called "When You Leave Israel and Enter Gaza, You Are God," and basically looks at the war crimes that IDF soldiers are committing, and in their own words, what they feel like is happening in Gaza. And I pulled out a couple of the quotes here. There are many more, but the two that really struck me was one junior officer saying, and this is a quote from that IDF officer in Gaza, "I felt like a Nazi. It looked exactly like we were actually the Nazis and they were the Jews." And then, another one about a commander who physically assaults a 4-year-old and says these kids need to be killed from the day they're born. And just like the extent of the depravity, and this is an almost like I think I've said on the PSAs numerous times now that if you haven't read Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, like it's the best thing you can read to understand what's happening here and like the ways in which the sort of unimaginable violence that these people are committing is sort of getting in their own heads too. Um, but just the clear way in which they're recounting the violence that they're committing, I think is something that's worth remembering for posterity, particularly as like people use this sort of um, accusation that comparing Israel to the Nazis is somehow anti-Semitic. Well, like IDF soldiers are making that comparison. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has been, doing these ongoing raids in Jenin in coordination with Israeli security services, where they've, killed a journalist and a number of other Palestinians. Uh, a lot of this appears to be a sort of appeal to the Israelis and an appeal to Trump. Basically, the Palestinian Authority, uh, because it has lost so much legitimacy and because it seems to be unable to manage events on the ground in the West Bank, is trying to reassert itself as a reliable security partner and to show Trump that like they're actually capable of cracking down on Palestinian militancy in the West Bank, even while they're attacking Palestinians while Israeli settlers run totally rampant across the West Bank and do things like set mosques on fire and tag them with racist graffiti and things. You'll note that both of these articles are from Al Jazeera, which has done some really good reporting on the ways that the Palestinian Authority has been sort of cravenly following Israeli security dictates. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as a result from all of that, the Palestinian Authority has now banned Al Jazeera from operating in the West Bank in the same way that Israel did um, to Al Jazeera like a couple months ago. And so, this has caused a giant international outcry. The UN is urging them to reverse the suspension. But again, it's hard to see this as anything other than um, a sort of nod to Trump and to Netanyahu, basically saying like, look, we can be your partners here. And the reasoning for the ban, as far as I understand it, is that Al Jazeera has been accused of provoking strife and interfering in internal Palestinian affairs, which is just like, yeah, nonsense, authoritarian speak. So, uh, yeah, we'll see whether or not that gets reversed, but it's not looking great. Meanwhile, in Syria, there's we could have done a whole PSA on Syria, so I'm really focusing just on how the Syria stuff is touching on Palestine largely. But if folks want me to get more into Syria stuff, I'm happy to do so. You can just let us know. Um, I I wanted to particularly draw attention to an NPR article that came out a few weeks ago, which was an interview with the new governor of Damascus, who said that Syria no longer wanted to be an enemy to Israel and they wanted to build friendly ties with Israel. And it caused this sort of like giant, um, outcry across the world, but also in Syria, right? Which, as we've talked about before, the Syrian people historically extremely, extremely anti-Zionist and very deep solidarity with the Palestinian cause. So that did cause these shockwaves that then, NPR had this follow-up report that I linked to here uh, from just a few days ago, showing that the the new Syrian government freaked out at the response to the governor of Damascus saying that, and the government distanced themselves from the governor of Damascus, and then the governor of Damascus himself issued a sort of video apology thing saying that, his words were misconstrued or whatever. So just to say that like that original thing made the rounds quite a bit, um, but the retraction didn't quite so much. So just important to remember, I think that like it's going to be hard for the new government in Syria to uh, build friendly relations with Israel, given how much Israel is hated by the Syrian public. But there are also, big ways in which the U.S. is increasing its military footprint in Syria, um, in ways that, we probably don't have time to get into in great detail here, but it looks to be setting up a new military base in Kobani, which is that city on the northern border that was the sort of famous flashpoint between Kurdish fighters and ISIS. And as ISIS is sort of appearing to re-emerge as the force to contend with in Syria, the US government is using that as a sort of pretext to build up its own military presence there, where it continues to coordinate with the Kurdish forces in a way that may very well change under Trump and puts them sort of on opposite sides of their Turkish allies, who very much are directly attacking. Like the Turkish military is shelling parts of Kurdish controlled Syria. So that whole thing is a mess. It's an absolute mess that is only looking like it's going to get worse. Um, there are plans, ostensibly, by the new Syrian government to unify all armed factions under the Syrian army, and apparently the Kurdish forces have offered to become part of the Syrian army as long as they can retain some level of autonomy, and those overtures have been rejected. So it's not really clear what's going to happen with that. And again, I think that's the thing we'll know a little bit more about in the coming weeks. In Lebanon, the dead-ish ceasefire is, further eroding. We talked a lot back in December about how Israel had not been adhering to the terms of the ceasefire, and now it looks like a new report in Israel Hayom is basically saying that the Israeli government is reconsidering its timeline of withdrawal from Lebanon based on the ceasefire that was signed on November 27th. They had 60 days to remove all Israeli troops from Lebanese territory, but they're still there. There are many, many, many troops all over the south. And the 60 days hasn't expired yet. It will in 3 weeks, I think. But the government is now saying, the Israeli government is now saying that they plan to keep the troops there longer than those 3 weeks because of the extensive Hezbollah weaponry and stuff that they're finding across the south, which, like, yeah, it's a very obvious pretext. And I thought the way that this article laid out the consequences of that was really good. Basically, what happens if they don't live up to their promise to withdraw? The answer is nothing, because there is no enforcement mechanism for the ceasefire, because the ceasefire is guaranteed by the United States and France to some extent. But if the United States doesn't do anything to rein in Israel, then it doesn't really mean anything when Israel violates the ceasefire. And so the only consequence that Israel might face is a resumption of full hot war. But Hezbollah doesn't seem to want that either, so it's hard to know what would actually happen here. And it's clear that Israel is sort of playing this game now where, Hezbollah is trying to send some warnings. They sent a warning rocket back in December as a response to the violations of the ceasefire agreement, and Israel responded to that by killing 9 people. So like they're trying to make even Hezbollah's attempts at deterrence here too costly. So the ceasefire doesn't look super likely to hold, but it's not clear that it would break in a way that would lead to a full resumption of hostilities. So we might end up in the sort of middle zone for a long time now. And, the coming weeks, once again, I think will tell us a lot. Meanwhile, Yemen's still going strong. Like everywhere else, nothing really seems to have changed much in Yemen, where they continue to be blocking ships and continue to be striking Israel, and they continue to say that they'll continue to do that until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And so there were a series of big U.S. airstrikes in Yemen just this past week, uh, but it doesn't seem to be, even after those U.S. airstrikes, the Houthis launched a missile at central Israel, and you can see on the right there all the red alert sirens that went off as a result of the Houthis firing a single missile. So it continues to be a really powerful deterrent force that the U.S. and Israel seem to be unable to contain at this moment. But that's where Yemen is currently sitting. There's no real movement on the genocide case at the International Court of Justice. But this Mondo Weiss Instagram post on what we've learned from a year at the ICJ, I thought was really good. The key piece here for me is just that since South Africa has submitted its comprehensive statement of evidence of genocide on October 28th, the ICJ gave Israel until July 28th of this coming year to respond, so July of 2025. Which means that the ICJ basically isn't going to be moving in any meaningful way unless circumstances drastically change for the next 6 months. So there isn't much to look for there, but it is important that, and this post goes into it, that we reflect on how the ICJ court case has failed to substantively change the material reality, but has in really important ways brought global attention and evidence to the scope of this atrocity and sort of cemented it as its proper name, like calling it a genocide, like not war crimes, not attack, not war, it's genocide. And I think that that has become the sort of popular understanding of what has happened. And that's important in its own right, but it also doesn't stop the violence. It's just the first step. And we need to build on that to actually change the material conditions that allow Israel to continue to carry out this genocide. In the context of that, I did want to note some huge BDS wins over the course of the last month. There have been quite a few. Um, I thought this article by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's the author of The Sympathizer, I think he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, who's been a very outspoken critic of the Israeli occupation and an early sign-on to the BDS movement, wrote this beautiful article about how he messed up his like commitment to BDS and why BDS is so important for Palestine. And this article in Truth Out that I think does a really good job of talking about all the different levels of how the boycott movement has really materially changed conditions across the Middle East and around the world. And like, these giant companies that are really feeling huge effects from the boycott movement, from like Carrefour, the French grocery chain, to McDonald's, to Starbucks. They're all sort of like dying out across the Middle East. But also like the ways in which the boycott movement not only has succeeded in putting a lot of economic pressure on companies that facilitate the genocide, but also, has been this incredible opening opportunity for all of us to sort of reflect on, these companies that are so complicit in these horrible things are themselves just like horrible institutions, right? And by cleansing them out of our lives, it's actually good for us too, right? It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the ways that um, we succumb to some of the horrible things that these companies are producing. And as we find alternatives to them, we're sort of building up a new way of engaging with each other in the world that I think is really beautiful. And at the opposite of things that are really beautiful, there's the looming Trump presidency that is now right around the corner. We've got 2 weeks and change left before the inauguration, and Trump and his proxies have made it really clear that the Palestinian rights movement is right in the crosshairs as soon as they come into power. and the danger of repression of that Palestine movement needs to be understood as like a, all hands on deck, immediate thing that needs to be handled in January and February as they start to go after folks who are trying to stop the genocide. Um, and I think really critically, it's important to see that as the first salvo in a broader campaign to kneecap the whole left generally, right? That they perceive Palestine to be the most vulnerable uh, part of like, you know, people movement building, environmental justice, racial justice, all the different things that we stand for, and using that as the sort of entry point to divide the movement and break it apart. And so we need to be prepared for that, and we need to maintain the sort of unity of purpose and vision that will prevent that from happening. And in addition to sort of the domestic implications of what the Trump presidency will bring, uh, it's worth noting that, in a recent interview with Time magazine, Trump has basically rejected his own 2020 peace plan, which called for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. So it seems that he's gearing up for the sort of like uh, greater Israel, like Zionist vision of full annexation of the West Bank and these incursions into Syria and Lebanon becoming permanent. Um, so it seems likely that the U.S. government apparatus is getting ready to sort of recognize Israeli annexation of more Palestinian and other Arab land in the coming months. So that's another thing we got to be ready for. Um, and to sort of bolster that, what we're seeing is a new propaganda push by the Israeli government, where they've announced a new $150 million in Hasbara, like propaganda funding to sway global opinion. This is a 20-fold increase from the amount of money they spent on this last year. So a huge jump in Israel's attempt to sort of, silence its enemies and promote its defenders. And they specifically get into how the targets of this propaganda campaign will be college campuses, social media platforms, traditional press, media, and that the plan for hitting those three things is to work in coordination with Jewish organizations in the United States that are sort of like allied with the Israeli government. And true to form, we just saw yesterday JCRC basically calling Oakland ground zero for anti-Semitic hatred in the Bay Area. And that's because somebody compared Israelis to Nazis at Lake Merritt, which, as we saw earlier in Haaretz, like is a thing that Israeli soldiers themselves are making that comparison. So um, I think that's a thing we really need to be vigilant for, the ways that they're going to try to make any criticism of Israel seem beyond the pale. And the last thing I wanted to close on was this remarkable update in Germany just 2 days ago, where German courts determined that a housing complex that was taken from a Jewish family during the Holocaust and given to like an Aryan German family had to be returned to its Jewish owners, basically saying like, yeah, it's sad for the Germans who live in it now, but it never belonged to them because it was stolen from them. And I think that's a really beautiful thing and a reminder in the ways that like I think history can the arc is long, right? But the precedent of like, hey, stealing people's land and homes and things, and even if you successfully steal it for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, at the end of the day, it's still stolen land and it's still stolen property, and it deserves to be returned to who it belongs to. And like, if that can still happen today, 70 years after the fall of Nazi Germany, I think that that does say something about what will happen for those in Palestine whose things are being stolen today and tomorrow. And so, summing it all up, I think there was a brief moment at the end of last year where it looked like Israel might be trying to wrap up its various military commitments in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Syria, but no. It seems like there are very few signs that things are wrapping up. And in many ways, the genocide is accelerating. But in the scope of that, there is a growing global consensus on the scale and horror of this genocide. And there's increasing proof and increasing reporting and analysis that I do think are going to shift dynamics in this coming year in a way that's going to make it really, really, really hard for people to deny what's happening there. And we should be prepared for that in terms of like our messaging and outreach and how we're going to advocate for accountability around complicity in that genocide. And in response to that, I think we need to expect a huge propaganda, like media, state repression push in the coming weeks and definitely in the coming months. And it's going to be hard for us and our movements. There is going to be a lot of pressure on us and our movements. And, we're tired, right? Like we've been through a lot. It's been, we're in our third calendar year of this, and it's easy, I think, in those moments to feel a lot of despair, but that's what they're counting on, right? And so we win by maintaining that sort of revolutionary discipline and unity, by maintaining a clear vision and purpose of what we're trying to achieve, and an unflinching, unapologetic commitment to the liberation, not just of Palestinians, but all people, including ourselves. So um, the repression is coming because we're winning, and it's important to remember that. And I know that we're tired, but we need to keep each other energized and optimistic in spite of all of the horrors, because yeah, we're doing a lot and we've done a lot. And I think it's important to reflect on our many victories and to be there for each other. And in terms of being there for each other, there's a lot coming this week. In the next 3 days, there's plenty to do. So tomorrow is the All Out for Palestine rally at 1 p.m. at Union Square, demanding the release of Hussein Abu Safie, as well as the sort of like broader end of the genocide of Palestinians. Quit um, is hosting Quit and Gay Shame are co-hosting a Queers for Free Palestine event on Sunday at Market and Castro. I'll definitely be there. Hope to see you. And Healthcare Workers for Palestine are holding a rally at San Francisco General on Monday from 11 to 1 p.m. again to demand the release of Hussein Abu Safie and an arms embargo. So I hope to see you at those. If you want to come to other events, please do check out the AROC events calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. Or if you want text updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604 and check out the PAL Media Tracker for news and articles that inform this analysis. And you can sign up for the media tracker at palmediatracker.com/sign up. And I think that actually does it. For once, we have a little bit of time.
Yeah, thanks, Samer. Just a note to everybody, as Samar mentioned, in addition to what's happening this week, this will obviously be a very busy month for organizing work here in the Bay, not only dealing with the incoming administration and the inauguration, which is happening on January 20th, but that's also when MLK Week of Action will be happening. And so our comrades at ABTP will be providing us with some updates on what actions, which undoubtedly will include work around Palestine solidarity, will be happening that week. And so you can go to the link to APTP's MLK Week of Action that Annie has just dropped, and we hope to have some more information next week and maybe have Annie come on and talk a little bit about what'll be on deck. So we'll be back next week. We're going to stick around just to answer a couple more questions in the chat, but appreciate you all being with us here in the new year, and we'll see you all soon.